On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Andrew Bihl. He is a co-founder and CTO at Numeric. We're going to be talking about product engineers, and we're going to be talking about how close or how far engineers should sit away from the customer. And a lot of that's going to come around feedback and understanding what to do with that feedback loop. And Andrew, I'm super excited to have you on the show to talk to us about this.
Yeah, thanks, Amir. I'm glad to be here. Excited to chat.
Absolutely. All right. Numeric, tell us what you guys do over there before we start recording the whole episode here.
Yeah, so we're a fairly early Series A company. Just announced Series A little while ago, and we are, I would say, broadly setting out to solve a lot of the root cause data issues that underlie the accounting department. So at a very high level, our goal is get our customers to accurate, rich, trustworthy, useful financial data as quickly as possible. That's a problem that really sits inside the accounting department. And our customers generally kind of cover the mid-market. So as early as Series B companies, but more of our customers are more on the late stage startup, early public company type track. So these are companies like Plaid and OpenAI and Brex and the like.
Awesome. Sounds like you guys got probably a lot of moving parts, a lot of growth in front of you, and that's exciting. This episode's going to be kind of centered around talking about a couple things. Obviously, product engineering. We're going to be talking about that feedback loop and really proximity to the customer, understanding the customer, the requirements, the roadmap, all that kind of stuff. And before we start, just because not everyone is familiar with product engineering at times, right? I think different companies have this function maybe in different ways or fashions. Maybe let's just start off with the definition of what a product engineer is, and then we'll dive on in.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's not always the same at every company, but at a large sort of slant, I'd say it's a pretty generalist engineer who's concerned with the overall product outcome. So not tied to maybe a particular part of the stack, certainly not specialized, but more generally trying to run as much of that track from customer to delivery as they can. So, for us, we kind of view it as the person who's able to build is also on deck to help figure out what to build and what problems we can take on.
So when it comes to engineering and feedback, maybe let's just actually start from that perspective. Let's talk about in typical companies, and if you want to use Numeric or maybe a previous experience, feel free to share some stories with us. Tell us a little bit about how that dynamic of the actual feedback to the engineering team, how does that typically work? What have you seen in terms of that workflow?
Yeah, I think maybe slightly stereotypically, but what is common is you kind of have a customer at one end, an engineer on the other end, and then in the middle, you'll have product managers, designers, maybe UX researchers, a whole cast of folks who are not engineers. And I think what I see play out a lot is this sort of semblance of engineers are there to figure out the how, and your product managers, your designers are really to figure out what to do. And so you'll end up with PMs that sort of sit increasingly as a curtain between the users and the engineers. And the idea is that the PM is going to go meet the users, think about the market, generally try to understand the use cases and the problems, and then try to translate that into what to do. And then engineering, again, maybe slightly caricaturizing, we'll get requirements docs and sort of notes on what it is we're doing. And that's when they're tapped in to try to think about timelines, risks, and how they're going to go implement, the plan as it was.
And I guess when we talk about this process, obviously as more layers are between the engineering team and the customer, obviously there's a lot of things lost in translation. I think generally speaking, technology, whether you're working in an enterprise or your software company, this is a very similar battle of that distance from a customer and understanding those requirements. And I guess from that standpoint, when we're talking about that feedback loop, this product engineering role obviously does lend itself a little bit different. And maybe talk to us a little bit, especially if somebody doesn't have this function in their organization. How does a product engineer then fit in within the dynamic of software engineering and their proximity to the customer?
Yeah, I think there's a few ideas that really drive how we think about it. One, talking to somebody is a much higher bandwidth pipe. I think probably a lot of engineers have been on the receiving end of a requirements doc, and then the nuance takes weeks or months to really pull out of like, what are we actually going for here? In a lot of cases, I think just putting me in front of, I mean, me being the engineer, putting an engineer in front of who they would benefit from talking to is actually genuinely a lot faster. There's a lot of subtlety and color that comes from talking with somebody that then makes its way into the planning. So I think part of it is it's just faster. Two, I think you get, frankly, like more buy-in from your engineers. I think one of the real challenges for engineering is it's a really hard role to hire for. It's really good engineers can make or break your company. And I think there's like something fairly, I don't want to say inhuman, but it can be a draining job not to have any direct interaction with the people who benefit from your work, who care about what you're doing. And the idea that engineers would go a whole career and not really get to talk to these people, I think is just a bad move. And so you see engineers kind of leave the field, need to take time away, or just like lose productivity. And even engineers maybe don't know where to point the finger other than to say like, it's not a very fulfilling experience at times, which is tough because it's a really hard job. And so I think, the goal of like trying to put engineers in front of customers is really twofold. I think the outcomes are better. I think you learn faster about the problem at hand. That mental model runs deeper in terms of what you're going to build. But even just in terms of a personnel thing, like I think you're going to run a happier company. You're going to attract better engineers if you can offer an experience that's a little bit more rewarding than, what they're used to. So I think that's sort of the goal, if that makes sense.
As you were speaking, I was actually thinking about engineers, right? And I think we can maybe go back to a bit of a stereotype and somewhat maybe not a stereotype as well, right? I think there's a little bit of truth to this. There was a long-standing notion that software engineers just wanted to code. That, don't talk to them about customers, don't talk to them about other problems. The old slide a pizza under the door, right? That was a horrible vision of what the software engineer should do. But that is something that exists, right? That is a stereotype. We'll leave that to people to decide, the truth and depth of that one or not. But is possibly that stigma, is that core philosophy around software engineers, did that actually precipitate these layers to the customer? Because potentially it was like, hey, listen, I don't want to deal with the customer, I just want to code. And now there's a whole ecosystem around insulating the software engineer from the customer.
It's a great question. One, there's probably some number of people who do fit the stereotype, like they really don't need or want to meet the customers. Maybe that's a fairly negative experience, but I don't think it's like nearly as many people as generally thought. But the flip side is like you do get the experience, which is like an engineer gets on a call with a customer, or they're not even like particularly happy to like be pulled into a meeting. Then they seem like, they're not really following the customer conversation, or that they're not happy to be there. And again, I think for most people, it's not actually a core personality trait. I think it's more like, like if you kicked down my bedroom in the middle of the night and like shook me awake and were like, Andrew, we got to go for a run like right now, I'm not gonna be thrilled. Like I'm not gonna be very happy that you've shaken me awake in the middle of the night. If you, the PM, walk away from that experience and your conclusion is like, man, engineers like do not like to exercise, like that's the wrong conclusion. Like the right conclusion is like, some base understanding, which is like they probably should exercise, even if I don't want to run all the time. Like it's good for me, but you can't shake me awake in the middle of the night. And I think like engineering does run into a pretty challenging tension, which is understanding the user, diving into the domain, like generally like building context and building out that mental model. On the ground, it looks like meetings, it looks like conversations, it looks like, sort of like exploring and discussing things, which is almost like perfectly in tension with what you need to do good engineering work, which is like long focused stretches of like pretty quiet time of like you or maybe like one other engineer. And so I think if you just sort of naively say, let's start throwing engineers into these meetings, you're going to get really bad outcomes, and the engineers are not going to like it either. There's a real risk then that everybody just says, like, we tried it, it failed, we're not doing that. But I think the real conclusion is like, have a sensitivity to what allows really good engineering to be done. And then in really simple terms, like, don't mess up those times. Like when you're doing the context gathering, you're probably not in deep focus. If you're in deep focus, don't, yank out and jump into a meeting. And so I think you do kind of need the rest of the organization to have a bit of nuance about how engineering works and like try to respect the game. Because you do kind of need other people to help, right? Like your sales team, they're having the most conversations with customers. If you've got a PM, they're often doing a lot of legwork to go build relationships, communicate with people, schedule things, figure out who to talk to. So you do kind of need an organization that's doing a lot of the setting up those relationships with customers and external folks to then feel that they can facilitate those conversations and then do so in a way that doesn't feel like getting shaken awake in the middle of the night. So I don't think it's that engineers hate meeting customers or don't want to. I just think like often the execution is really not done correctly.
I'm really glad you brought that up. So it's been a while since I was a software engineer, but I remember context switching was my least favorite part of the job because it almost feels like when you break that train of thought and you're working on a solution, to go back and pick up that mindset of where you were is not always easy. I actually agree with you. I actually think most engineers, given a choice, I don't believe in the stereotype that they don't want to talk to customers. I actually agree with you. I think it's just the fact that they do such deep work that it's really difficult to do that context switching. And then it comes off as your example exactly illustrated with me shaking you awake in the middle of the night to go for a run. That's exactly correct. And I don't know if that's communicated. I actually think that's a really good point you brought up. I don't know if enough people understand that part of this job for them to understand of, hey, what's the big deal that you're just jumping on a call? And I don't know if the software engineers don't do a good job of explaining that, or we assume, hey, listen, it's coding, you should just know, you don't want to be bothered, which then comes off to the slide the pizza under the door stigma from 20, 30 years ago. I think you bring up a really good point. And I guess if you were just kind of continue that and think about how do you communicate that so that in more elaborate organizations, even this matrix is even more complicated. There's a lot more context switching. People just get inundated with meetings. They don't do anything. Is there a way of communicating that without coming off seeming like my job is more important than theirs? Because this is really then the real rub. What do you think? How do you think we could make a dent there?
One, I think it's actually like everybody probably wants to do the right thing. And, even outside, it's like not sort of engineers just serving engineering, like talk to a designer, a salesperson, a product manager, an operations person. Like everybody kind of wants to work at the company with the best product. And if you're a software company, like the best products generally are coming out of the companies with really good engineering. So I think like everybody kind of wants this thing. And so it ends up being a bit more of like an empathy understanding thing where, again, for like a stereotypical SaaS company, like engineering is a bit of a distinct operation, which is like, you could go sit in on a sales call and like, I could sit in on a sales call. It doesn't make me a good salesperson, but I can see I can understand what I'm seeing, right? Like I can sort of get a bit of the impression of like what they're doing just from observing from the outside. And the same is basically true of almost any job. Like go observe what they're doing and you can kind of grok what you're seeing. Again, it doesn't make you great at the job, but you get a picture of it. But unless you have the background, like I don't know how long a salesperson would need to sit next to an engineer to just like watch the code to figure out what's happening. Like we sort of sit up on this hill, which can be really a bad thing, which is like it's not easy for others to know what goes into the game, and it's really hard to tell from the outside. Which honestly is just like a translation thing. I mean, if the sales calls were done in Russian, then I couldn't go listen to the sales calls and pick up on the work at hand. And then I think the other thing is other jobs do tend to be more interrupt driven, where you can kind of like squeeze in. If you need to send emails and you get 15 minutes, like you could send 15 minutes of emails, and that's true for a lot of jobs where like you can just sort of carve down and use whatever available time. Engineers know like if I need 30, 40 minutes to get really into a problem before I can start making progress, 30 minutes rounds to zero if I get interrupted at that point. And again, in a software company, there's just like not that many roles that have that dynamic. So I think for us, a lot of the best answer has been like, share it with people. I meet with every single hire here, not just engineers, but everybody that walks in the door. And I think a lot of my job is like try to help others form a useful mental model for how engineers work, because we kind of need their help. And I think without that empathy and understanding like where this is coming from, it all feels very arbitrary of like, don't interrupt me in this 3-hour block is like, it's a very different experience. So I think for us just like sharing a bit of what we do and trying to explain it is really helpful. And I think that's mostly enough because everybody really does want to sort of like drive towards the best product outcome, at least like at an early company.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think you kind of illustrated some of the differences, the nuances in different roles. And I've been a part of the sales process. You've been a part of the sales process. There's some super complex pieces that, I think have similar attributes, other roles as well. So I think to everything you've said, I think a lot of roles have similar context switching penalties. I think software engineering has some unique ones that maybe are not understood. And I think, as you kind of mentioned, being closer to the customer, kind of tying back to some of the original parts of the conversation, whereas if we want to be closer to the customer, there needs to be some, frameworks. There's some opportunities to be closer that don't incur those context switching. In that sense, what have you seen work for software engineers, product engineers, to get closer to the customer and reduce that context switching?
Yeah, I think one, so Anthony's my co-founder, also incidentally also studied computer science, but operates as a PM for us. A lot of, and some companies will be on the stance of like, we don't want any PMs. I think they tend to be pretty technical products as well, where the engineers are like their own customers. But I'm not in the world of like no PMs, because I think it's really, really helpful to have that. And so I think a good PM that is sort of trying to play this game will go do a lot of the legwork to figure out like what are the right conversations, which is a substantial amount of thinking, and like maybe having some of the wrong conversations to go figure out like, what's potentially the right audience for a problem we want to take on. And then for us, like our sort of picture of a product engineer is like, once we think there's the right problem to take on and the right audience or rough audience to go focus on, of like who's going to be the first set of customers if we go try to solve this problem, immediately go figure out who the engineer is who's going to really be the lead on that project. And I think the goal is like, get an engineer in the room before we're to the defining what we're actually going to build phase. Get the engineer in immediately, and then really just like carve out time and carve out some stretch of like, let's go queue up the meetings. What we don't want to do is like pull an engineer off of, their more regular engineering work and then say, let's go try to find some meetings. Like, if you're getting help from the rest of the org, it should be, we've scheduled things, we've clumped them together, and we're going to spend, some days at the beginning of this thing to really build some context here. So it ends up just being really basic, which is like, if you can get help coordinating, scheduling these conversations, and then try to like squish them together, it ends up being not too unpleasant. I think splitting up hours and minutes is really terrible. But taking a day out of the week when it's coming is actually not so unpleasant. And then just having a structure where you figure out in time, this project, this engineer, here's when we'd like to start work. Like, here's when we probably want to go do the sort of research and negotiating out like where we think we might go build this thing. And that's tended to work for us pretty well. And then depending on the size of the project, you may have like multiple cycles of like, cool, let's take what we learned, run into the maze of product development a little bit, accumulate some learnings, and then like, we're going to pause, put this thing down for a couple of days and go back out to the sort of zoomed out view of things. So it just depends on the project size, if you need to do that multiple times for the same effort.
Absolutely. And maybe going back to the product engineer role, I know we were kind of talking about that and how having the product engineer might have a different effect on the workflow, participating in the overall roadmap. Maybe talk to us a little bit about how particularly the workflow or the roadmap might be affected if you do have that product engineering role versus software engineers and other people who potentially make up that similar function.
So one of the other reasons that I really care about this is going back to that picture of like the like maybe stereotypical traditional company. If you have a plan in place, you run on down the engineering, like one of the challenges of software engineers is like the topography of how hard things are going to be is really unpredictable. You kind of go in with a plan and, famously like estimates are all over the place. And if you have an engineering org where the estimates have like a 40% error, like variance, it's not that they're getting everything wrong 40% all the time. It's that they're getting almost everything right. And then the one thing that's wrong is off by 10,000%. So it throws the whole plan off. And then there's all these little subtle choices of, here's a thing that we didn't consider when that requirements doc was written. Like, let me put this down, go schedule a meeting to figure out how much this matters. A couple days go by, come back to it, run into another, sometimes a little subtle corner, sometimes big question. And so that like going into the maze, running into some unanticipated challenges, putting it down, having a conversation, involving who knows how many people in a meeting, going back, going forth, like, it's not just like 10 or 20% slower. It's like you could burn months just doing that. And so I think a lot of what really makes this work is, I just think of it in terms of like how full is somebody's mental model before they go into the maze. And success looks like I start working on a problem, I'm running into some of these questions and things we hadn't thought about, and I have an instinct about this audience, these customers, this domain, where maybe half of those I can answer on the spot and say, you know what, like that, I know an appropriate behavior for that thing. This part is actually way harder than we expected, but it's not core to the thesis of why we're doing this. I'm going to cut this scope, and here's something that we are going to do, but honestly, I can probably hack this, get a first version. This isn't the thing to invest in. It's trying to raise that watermark of how big of a problem do I have to hit where I need to pause this and go have a conversation. And so again, my earlier description of like try to front load the context building and then let the engineer really get into it is this idea, which is like, let's go do the homework up front and then trust engineers to take that context and turn it into these like on the fly decisions that make the difference between do I chat with the engineer next to me, we come up with a good default choice and then move on, or do we have to pause this thing and then go schedule a meeting and we've just burned a whole day on something that like might have taken a day in total. So it ends up just pushing a lot of the context gathering earlier, really heightens the value of getting those conversations in place, going deep as an engineer and making sure you feel like you really understand something. And then the last piece is you have to treat the product itself as the flexible variable. Like I think if you've got a goal, a pain point, and a rough timeline of like, oh, we think this is, we're going to spend a couple weeks on this, then the variable that has to shift to make sure you hit the timeline and like be able to deliver something is what exactly is the product. So for me, what that is like, well, if I work with an engineer, I feel that they've got a good picture of this, they've got the context. Basically, like, if I trust them and we feel like we've done our homework, then the decisions they make along the way to keep the plan sort of intact means I don't get to predict exactly what that product is going to be. What I get to predict is like, if we're wildly off the timeline, I'm probably going to hear about it. And if I don't hear anything, then they're still running and moving forward and not getting blocked. And so it ends up being, just sort of like splitting context earlier and then making the space for engineers to make the calls. And then everybody has something that is a big enough speed block where you run into it and think, okay, I got to put this down. This merits a conversation about whether the plan as a whole like makes sense, for example. But it's probably like 5% of the problems you run into are that, and the other 95% are like subtle judgment calls of how big or small is this problem and can I make a choice and move on.
This episode, I think the more I've been talking to you, asking you questions, I realize that it really is a context switching dynamic that we're dealing with. Even a product engineer or what we're talking about, the feedback loop, obviously context switching is very expensive. You're a co-founder, CTO. I was just kind of curious, in your world, you obviously have to have a lot of context switching. How do you manage it? Because you wear your own different hats. Obviously, we've talked about software engineers, but how do you manage that?
I think I made a pretty common like founder CTO mistake of like trying to hold on to like large pieces of the engineering after it was productive. So concretely, like if you're in a role where you're going to get interrupted frequently, like I do a lot of recruiting, and recruiting is really time sensitive. You got to keep the ball moving forward. You don't get to push things to your calendar. Like you just have to be really responsive, especially like if you have a candidate you're excited about. Like you have to do what you can to make it move quickly and be an excellent experience. It's sort of non-negotiable. I mean, this is sort of the challenge with any, dealing with people outside the company is you end up running to really hard walls, which is like, I don't get to shift their schedule. So I think concretely, like the biggest thing is just acknowledging, looking at your schedule, like, okay, cool. Like there's a pretty hard limit on how big a responsibility I can take on while I'm working this way. Which means, I can go fix bugs. I can go do some small refactors. I can go help people. But I care a lot about like ownership. I think like really good work is when you kind of care about the whole outcome and also know that it's on you to see it the whole way through, which is, as an engineer, kind of painful, but it's, it's like, I'm going to ship something. And then if it's broken, that's on me. If it's not scaling, what we learn in feedback from customers, like it all comes back to me, the sort of owner of this thread. In really simple terms, at some point, just looked around and realized like, I cannot be the critical component for any of the big efforts because I can't commit the continuous time and attention to really go deep that this problem merits. So it's mostly just like getting out of the way and realizing like I can't really operate as an engineer in the way that I would hope my engineers, like my teammates, can. And so just constraining my role to like the smaller hits, to the things that acknowledge the realities of like my schedule. I think to do it the other way, you would probably just see half-baked work or things that like get shipped, but then you can't follow up on all the things that come after. So yeah, occasionally I'm like, don't feel very much like an engineer, but it's much easier to acknowledge that and then figure out what you can do than to try to keep doing the old thing without respecting the sort of realities on the ground.
Awesome, Andrew. I appreciate the insights. Great conversation. Thank you for your time. I know you got to do another context switch to actually get back to your work and the recording. But if somebody does want to reach out to you, because we touched on a lot of different things, but mainly product engineering, context switching, some of that feedback loop component from the customer. If somebody wants to reach out to you to discuss something you mentioned, what's a good way of getting a hold of you?
People can just send me an email. It's my first name at numeric.io. And yeah, always happy to get notes. Any engineers, or if you know engineers that you think want to kind of play this very product centric, like high ownership game, put me in touch. Always happy to chat with folks.
Awesome, man. I really do appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amir.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Two things until then. One, I think this episode with Andrew really was lots of examples, very informative. I think we talked about a lot of details that touch on a couple of core things about that feedback loop, about context switching, that product engineering side. I think a lot of companies deal with this, and as Andrew mentioned, we must do a little bit better job to even explain to them what we do and why that context switching is important. I don't know if we always do, but I think that's actually a great suggestion, is to communicate that out more. Share this with somebody else who experiences this. I think a lot of engineers out there understand this friction of context switching. I'm sure it's something that's very common, but share this with somebody else. Let's get a discussion going on how we can actually communicate this better to other parts outside of engineering. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.